I went and attended the Community Land Ownership Conference in Skye last June, just because I wanted to talk to people who were from these community buyouts. It was really quite emotional to hear them talk about how their ancestors had been excluded from this land. One guy said to me, I wish my grandfather could see us now. He said, it's ours. It's ours, finally. And it didn't mean mine. It's not mine. It's ours.
Much of my academic research to this point has been devoted to understanding how our systems of property end up watering down otherwise promising social and environmental solutions. Agroecological farming, the land prices are just too high. High-speed rail, landowner holdouts. New tenant protections, predatory landlords. Common sense environmental regulation, farmer protests. It's something I'm still working on elaborating, showing how the potential of landscapes to be what we need them to be is really just closed off by the overwhelming state-backed power, property. And there's more work to be done here, not just arguing that this is the case, but measuring how property influences different types of social and ecological practices. This is important. If property is as powerful as I see it, all of us engaged in proposing some new model for land use or for environmental sustainability ought to be wary of how these plans articulate with the current property regime. But I've also started to look ahead to what is the obvious next question. If some systems of property are blocking us from a sustainable future, how do we go about changing these systems? Is it some kind of legal innovation? A social movement for new types of land relations? Some kind of conservative political campaign? For today's episode, I was curious to understand more about the People's Land Policy, a group in England pushing for land reform from within neoliberalism's beating heart. The group recently published Towards a Manifesto for Land Justice, a document that argues for the need to transform land relations in order to deliver social and environmental goals like affordable housing, food security, and environmental sustainability. In this document and others, they lay out a number of political demands, things like restoring the commons, the establishment of national land assemblies, and the creation of new powers for community ownership. Bonnie VandeSteeg is a scholar and activist, part of the People's Land Policy. I wanted to speak with her to ask, once you believe that property is the problem, how does one even begin to go from there? I'm Adam Calo, and you're listening to Landscapes. Here's Bonnie VandeSteeg.
I'm part of the People's Land Policy. I'm also the author of a book called Land for What, Land for Whom, Senses of Place and Conflict in the Scottish Highlands. I'm particularly interested in the problem of land use conflict, the fact people who live in a particular place may see the land completely differently. So if they're a farmer, or if they're a mountaineer, or if they're working in conservation, they may see the same place in a completely different way. And this leads to conflict. And this conflict is a real problem because it means that we can't solve some of the serious environmental and social problems that we're currently facing. And the reason why this conflict is particularly strong is because a lot of powerful people in the Cairngorms, for example, the large landowners, the property developers, are keen that ordinary people don't have the opportunity of actually coming together and having their voices heard, which is why my research led me to believe that something like community land ownership and land reform would be a way of ensuring that even if people have conflict between them about how land is used, they're able to engage with each other directly and find more common ground than they would normally find in the current situation where they're kept divided by a certain discourse, incomer versus outsider, or different cultural traditions.
How does your background relate to the work of the People's Land Policy?
I was a sixth form college teacher, but during that time I was involved in quite a lot of grassroots activities around housing. So that was what got me interested partially. And I ended up doing a PhD in anthropology, and the title was on basically land use conflicts in the Highland of Scotland. So when I retired, I had more time. And the first thing that happened is that I was at a Radical Housing Network meeting in London, and someone from the Community Food Growers Network came to our meeting, and he said, we would like to make some links between food growers and housing people around the issue of land. And because I'd done this research in Scotland, I was already tuned into the idea of land. So I immediately volunteered to be the delegate from the Radical Housing Network to what ended up being a working group to put together a conference, which we called Land for What. And this conference was, I think it was 2017, and it brought together people from the food growing movement, housing movement, environment movement, people from Scotland, community land trusts. I mean, there was over 200 people there, and it was really a brilliant event. And after that, we decided to carry on in some form, and we formed the Land Justice Network. This eventually fell apart, but within the Land Justice Group, there was a group of us that called ourselves the Policy Working Group. We had this idea that we should be working towards a people's land policy. And because I think it was the Land Workers Alliance had a people's food policy, so we liked this idea of a people's land policy. And in addition to that, I had time to turn my thesis into a book. And because now everything was around land, I was thinking very much in terms of land. I actually, when I edited the thesis into a book, the title became Land for What, Land for Whom. So the two things came together, one, my own research, and on the other hand, my activity in these grassroots groups, coming from housing, but then meeting all these other people who were doing things on different issues. But we realized it was all about land, whether it was food, whether it was housing, whether it was environment. It was all a question of who has access to the land, how we use that land, and who, probably most importantly, who gets to make the decisions about how that land is used and who benefits. So all that came together. We decided to carry on. I think this is roughly 2019. And we decided to work on this document, the People's Land Policy.
So you have these different people who are working on social issues, food, housing, democracy of decision-making over valuable assets. And it leads back to, if we follow the root drivers up, it comes back to land, right? And then out of this land justice network, you have a group of people who are committed to policy change. Why do we need a new land policy? What problems might be solved through such an enactment of policy?
I think really the term policy, I think we realized was maybe in the end not the best term, because immediately makes people think that we're just focused on legislative change. We see the work on it more as a document which is inspirational in a way, inspirational and aspirational. It's also part of education, so people can see what are possible things we could do. And it's also meant to be part of movement building in general. So I think that's what we were, the policy working group within the Land Justice Network, but really the policy was not separated from, everything else that we did, like actions or education. So I see policy, we need changes in the law, if you look at policy as a law, but more importantly, you need to be building up this grassroots movement in order to get real change.
Okay, interesting. So, of course, policy, not just in the terms of new acts of legislation, but also new ways of making decisions, maybe new cultural norms.
Yes, that's right.
What kind of problems might be solved through these new ways of relating to land? Why aren't the existing solutions in housing, for example, let's just build more, let's build more housing? That doesn't necessarily have a land process of change to it. Why is that not sufficient?
Well, I think if you take each issue on its own, for example, you mentioned the whole housing thing. Well, housing competes with other land uses. So if you say we're going to build more housing, then immediately you have the issue, well, where is that housing going to go? And maybe that land could have been used for food. Maybe it could have been used for biodiversity. Maybe it could have been used for a park. So there's always going to be these competing land uses. And this is what happens, I think, in the movement, that people get focused on, let's do something about housing. Other people are thinking about doing something about food, but really they're fighting over the same crumbs of land that are being offered. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that because primarily land is still owned privately, therefore the amount of land available to do public interest projects, shall we say, whether it be housing, food growing, environment, is limited. So if we've only got a small bit of land and different groups of people are fighting over how that land should be used, then that creates a problem. So therefore, we have to do two things. One, we have to bring people together so they're actually in the same space making decisions about how land is used. And secondly, we need more land to do things for the public benefit. Because if we have that, then it's not a question of, do we grow food? Do we build houses? Do we save a woodland? Or what do we do with a particular piece of land? So I think that's one of the reasons why land is a useful way of looking at all these issues. And people aren't necessarily going to agree. I think we have to realize that people, for various reasons, have different views on how land should be used, because that's what I found in my research in Scotland, that people who were there for conservation reasons saw the place completely different from people who saw land as a way of making a livelihood. But what we need is a space for those people to come together in order to make those decisions about land and try to understand different people's perspectives. And we can't do that if we're not in that same space talking about land, and if we don't have enough land to actually be doing anything with, because there's only a small amount of land that we can actually, especially in the cities, for example, because so much of it is just given over to property developers.
So this might be jumping ahead a little bit. There's an interesting tension there, because if the problem is distribution of ownership, but at the same time, you want to create an inclusive decision-making process about how we should use land, then who do you invite to the table? Because on the one hand, you might have the property owners or those who own the majority of land versus the others, as you said, who have just the crumbs.
Yes, well, that's why you need land reform. That's why I'm saying that it's a question of two things. One, getting people together so that they're actually working together rather than at odds with each other for social justice, because all these campaigns are for social justice, but they often are at odds, as I'm saying, because there's only a limited amount of land. Therefore, in order to get more land, it's got to come from somewhere. And that land, because most of it is owned privately, it needs to come from the private ownership. So therefore, you need some kind of land redistribution, and which is, of course, the sticking point for many people, because we do talk about that in the People's Land Policy quite overtly, that it's not just a question of getting landowners to do the right thing. And it's not a question of even give the landowners giving over some of their land for agroecology or some of their land for public benefit. You really do need to challenge the fundamentals of the landowning system. And that doesn't mean people's own houses. I think it's something like 5% of land is privately owned for housing. So we're really talking about the big landowners, the large farmers, and all that land that is in private hands that is not necessarily used for the public benefit. It's mainly used for private profit. And therefore, that land needs to go from those people to the majority of people who will use it for public good. And not just public, because that's what I'm saying. It's not just a question of using land in the right way. You also have the social justice issues involved in it. So it's not just, okay, land is now being used for the right reasons, but it's still owned by the big landowners. In order to truly have social justice, you need to have everyone involved in that land. It's their home, it's their place, it's their communities. They need to be involved in making decisions about how that land is used, and they need to get the benefits of that, and not just, as I said, crumbs before maybe some small benefit might transfer down to a local community from a private landowner. But really, you need to transfer that land to basically the community, which of course is the other whole issue that we do talk about in the People's Land Policy. And we have various ideas for that. But you have to also keep in mind that there's different levels of demands in the People's Land Policy. There's some that are truly, I would say, revolutionary, and there's others are things that people can campaign for on a day-to-day basis. That's why, in a way, the actual document, the manifesto, might appear to be a bit of a mishmash between, I would say, short-term goals to a much broader vision where we would like to see the whole land system transformed into a kind of commons where no one owns land and people are stewards of that land. And we have found, when we've been doing our work and distributing our manifesto to people, there's quite a lot of support for that idea. In one of the workshops we did, for example, a grower was saying he wanted land to grow food, and he says, I don't need to own that land, he said. I want land that I can belong to. And I think more and more people are getting this idea that we don't have to own the land. And it's so much part of the culture of the West, in particular. I don't know if it's particularly the UK, but when you look at the global South with Indigenous people and all sorts of other land rights campaigners, they don't have that same fetish about private property. It's a way of changing the way we look about land. And increasingly, I think people are beginning to question this idea that why should some people own so much of the UK and have all the benefits of that land?
So you mentioned these two documents that are part of the People's Land Policy, and that's what caught my attention. So there's this one that is towards a manifesto for land justice, and the other is working towards a People's Land Policy, which is more recent. Can you summarize the process of how these documents come together?
Well, the first one was working towards a People's Land Policy. That was the first one. The manifesto came out of it. So the manifesto is the more recent one, and it's meant to be summarizing a bit some of the key points from the bigger document. So it all came about, as I said, it mainly came about during COVID. So the Land Justice Network ceased to exist. We continued to meet then in 2020, and we decided during COVID that why not have a series of seminars? So what we did is we organized in all 10 seminars, and they were grouped into 3 areas. One was land and environment, the next one was land and food, and the next one was land and democracy or decision making. The whole aim was to find out for people in those campaigns what's important to them, what do they need from the land, in order to give us some idea of what kind of land reform would be important. And to get them to think about, well, what kind of land reform, what kind of changes in land policy would help you achieve the aims that you want to achieve. So by doing those 10 seminars, and they took place over probably a year and a half, they had really a wealth of information. We got up to, 150 people attending the seminars. This was during COVID, so a lot of people were willing to go to things like that. And we documented everything, and we wrote reports on each one. And we even sent out some of those reports to people who had been to get feedback. And the end result was the first pamphlet working towards People's Land Policy. So we distributed a lot of them. We got more feedback from people. Then we thought, well, it's a bit unwieldy. I mean, it wasn't some massive document or anything, but we thought, well, maybe if we could try to look at what seemed to be the key demands so that we could make it a little bit more focused than it was. And the end result of that was the Manifesto for Land Justice. So this is sort of bringing out what we thought were the most important ideas of the previous document. And note the word towards in all of these, because we don't feel that we've got the definitive document. That's why we feel it's a working document that's meant to be discussed and used by people as part of building a movement. It's not a political party manifesto in any way. It's a working document. It's meant to stimulate discussion. And we've distributed, well, thousands really, to various people over the past few years.
And what are some of the policy ideas that come out of this? You mentioned at one end extreme, you have a little bit more revolutionary in terms of land distribution, and others that are a little bit more middle of the road. For example, one of them is this idea of creating a land commission. In the document, it writes, establish a land commission that covers ownership, land rights, land management, and the use of land, both rural and urban. This will take evidence at public events held regionally and operate with high levels of participation from all sections of society. What is the role of a land commission as a policy idea here?
So land commission is something that has actually been talked about. I mean, in Scotland, certainly, which is where we got the idea from. And there has been a Liverpool land commission. And currently there's a Southwark land commission as well. But we want it to be something that is actually from the grassroots up. So it's an important idea, first of all, because it brings all the different players together. It's the potential for bringing all different parts of a community together who have different interests, who want to use land for different things, have different positions in that community in terms of hierarchy. It's a way of bringing them together, obviously with the problems of making it work democratically, which is a big question in itself. So that's why land commission is a good idea. It brings people together and it looks at the whole picture. There's so many issues, but they can't be looked at separately because they're all part of the same system. So by bringing them together under the idea of land commission, people can be in the same space. We also talk about land assemblies, and in some ways a land assembly might be sounds a little bit more grassroots. So one of the ideas in a manifesto is that every local area would have a land assembly, and it would gather together people from all different campaigns, community groups, etc., to come together, look at their area and say, well, how is land being used at the moment? Who owns it? Who benefits, etc.? And it would be a space for all of this to be discussed. The Land Commission, I suppose, has been a little bit more official. But in Southwark, for example, the Southwark Planning Network, which is a community group, has been quite influential on this land commission. And they have now published a document about land use in Southwark, which is a very interesting document. So this is why this is a short-term aim, because it is actually happening. The problem then lies in getting any of it implemented. And this is why any changes or any policies that we're putting forward in our document, we're well aware, need to have a mass movement in support of it. So the Land Commission or Land Assembly idea, it's more grassroots level, I think is an important idea because it brings people together in the same space in order to talk about the issues and understand different points of view. And if it had some teeth, then it could begin to institute some important changes within a local area. And that could be in a city, or it could be in the countryside, that might cover a wider acreage than it might do in like a London borough. It might be a bigger area in the rural areas.
So I do want to ask about the teeth, right? Because one of the other high-level goals, it seems to me, is something like a Land Reform Act for England, something similar to the Scottish Land Reform Acts. Is this a high-level goal in your mind, and why do you need to reach for that level of legislative change?
In some ways, I don't see it as high level. The overall aim is to have all land as a commons and to have all land being organized from the grassroots, from the community level, on the principles of stewardship. This is a very high level aim because it does require completely changing the system of private property. So a Land Reform Act, such as in Scotland, therefore, is not really a high level demand because it actually happened in Scotland. Though it might seem, I think the problem is that people have very low aspirations. Given what's happened politically over the past few decades, any progressive legislation is being, cut back, really. Really, some of the ideas that we have, wouldn't have seemed out of place back in the 70s or something, and now appear to be completely radical for some reason. So what might seem a really high-level demand, like a Land Reform Act, shouldn't really be a high-level demand, because really it's keeping the same system we've got at the moment, and it's making a few changes, which is what happened in Scotland. Nevertheless, is something that is probably not a short-term one, because it does something like that requires the political parties to be in favour. And I don't think we've got that situation in England. Wales maybe, but certainly not England that there is in Scotland. So Scotland was able to do a Land Reform Act because there was some kind of mass movement, and there's also some kind of history. The memory of the clearances and the whole narrative about what happened with people coming in and taking over the land and throwing people off the land. So there was more of a grassroots swell for land reform than there is in England. But let's look at some of the things they did in Scotland. I see no reason why they couldn't happen in the rest of the UK, such as the right for the community to buy land, which seems to be a fairly small change. It's not taking over the whole land system, but it's allowing certain parts of land to be bought by the community. And it seems to me this could be something that could be part of a Land Reform Act that would motivate people. And it could be in the rural areas, or it could be in urban areas as well. So giving people first option to buy, setting up some kind of fund for communities to be able to finance these buyouts. Other low-key demands are things like making sure there's more county farms, that there's more money for things like for the ecological land co-op, for example. These are all things that could be part of a Land Reform Act. And there was some move to that with the Land for the Many document that was commissioned by the Labour Party, even though they took up very few of the actual points that were presented in this document about land reform.
Is that still in the current Labour Party, or has it been dropped?
No, I mean, it was Jeremy Corbyn, and even Jeremy Corbyn didn't actually take on board most of it. This illustrates to me the problem. You will not get anywhere near a Land Reform Act bill, or even a bill for a Land Reform Act, if you don't have more of a grassroots movement in favour, because politicians will not change what they're doing, will not develop policy, challenges anything in the current system unless they're forced to do so. Most of the key changes that have happened over in the past few decades have all been due, well, since World War II, have been due to mass movements of some kind. I mean, many of the changes in the 50s were when the people came home from World War II and insisted that they had certain rights and benefits after having been in the war for 6 years, which is why we're the people's land policy, but at the same time, we're well aware that to get to these, be able to have these changes, we have to get more support, and we have to get a movement that is in favor of these changes. And that's, I suppose, what we see as our role at the moment in the documents that we produced, is more trying to inspire people, ordinary people, community groups, campaigns, etc. We don't think we're particularly going to have much influence on politicians. Potentially, the Green Party has shown sometimes interest in things. We did have some members of the Green Party come to some of our seminars. But on the whole, we're not the kind of group that has much leverage with most politicians.
Maybe we could talk about a recent example of kind of a change process that came from more of social campaigning. And, as an outsider, of course, there's a lot of media about this, was the campaign efforts and then the recent legal decision that upheld recreational access to Dartmoor National Park. In the mainstream media, it was described as a major victory for public access rights. But on the website, on the People's Land Policy website, it also seemed that maybe the legal decision didn't go far enough. It states that we cannot rely on flimsy bylaws to protect our basic rights. Can you describe the background around this campaign and then why maybe this route through legal decisions is insufficient?
We know the people that set up the Right to Roam campaign because they were all in the Land Justice Network with us. And they decided to focus only on the Right to Roam issue. The quote actually comes from the Right to Roam campaign itself. They're the ones who said that we shouldn't just rely on flimsy bylaws. Something like that does have quite a lot of opposition is very easy to overturn. And I think so here in this situation in Dartmoor, it was possible for a landowner to get the Right to Wild camp overturned. So obviously, it doesn't feel very secure if powerful landed interests can change policy so easily. And I think that's why we would support the Right to Roam campaign. That would be good to have a national law. But even then, it's only as strong as the ability to enforce it. So people talk very much about the right to roam in Scotland. But the thing is for large parts of the year, you don't have the right to roam because of the grouse shooting and the stag hunting. So I've often been turned away from places, even on major hills, because they were doing stalking. You don't necessarily get the right to roam, because if you've got powerful landed interests, then they will find ways of excluding you if they want to. So what needs to happen continually is for people to challenge it. We don't talk a lot about the right to roam in our document, because again, a lot of it depends on how you make decisions about how land is used. And we're quite wary of top-down solutions to things. And even though I know there's so many unjustifiable refusals of the right to roam on the part of landowners, there very well might be land uses that would have a problem. So, for example, you could have many small farmers, agroecological farmers. And I notice in the Land Workers Alliance that they support the right to roam, but their policy is, of course, with the agreement of farmers, working with local farmers. And I think that's important. It can't just be, we've got the right to roam and we're going to go where we want type attitude. It's got to be looking at how that land is used, working with people on the ground. It's trying to also overcome the urban-rural divide, which is, in fact, very large. So the other issue, for example, on the right to roam is also conservation. I mean, there are probably areas where I don't think we should be going, because maybe there's making a special effort to rewild or protect a particular species, so they don't necessarily want loads of people coming in and wild camping or what. I know many of my friends in Scotland had to deal with the issue of wild camping, where people were coming up and camping along the shores of Loch Morlich, for example, in Scotland, and just leaving tents and barbecues, etc., etc. And I think we would prefer that these kind of decisions were made in conjunction with the local community. And I mean local community at all its levels. I don't mean the local landowner, but it's looked at as a sort of mixture of people from the cities who want to come walk on the land or canoe or whatever, and also the people that live there. And I think a lot of people in the cities, it's true. I mean, I was one of them. Before I did my research in Scotland, I very much was just someone who went out into the mountains to do my walking, and I really didn't have any understanding of what went on there. We do need to have more understanding of what's going on in these rural areas. We understand the farmers and the foresters and the people working in conservation. So again, it's how it's done. So laws, yes, laws are important, but laws have to come from a groundswell of opinion and need to be enforced, managed by some kind of a local community that is truly democratic, where the normally excluded voices are actually heard.
With that stance in mind, how do you see this trend of what appear to me as long-term, sophisticated legal challenges to win rights for nature against climate change? You know, these cases, for example, in the U.S., the case in Montana, in which a number of people who are under the age of 18 challenged the state's constitution that suggested it had to provide a healthy environment. What do you think about this strategy to appeal to the courts? It seems like it is kind of a bottom-up strategy, but it's also very legally focused.
I think that if it's part of a grassroots movement, then I think it could be quite useful in terms of raising the profile of the issues. See, that's the thing, is that if you have a proper grassroots movement, then there will be a number of strands to it in terms of activity, and different people might pursue different types of action. If that's all that's done, then I think it's very limited. If it has no basis in a grassroots movement, then I think it's very limited. Fighting for a land reform bill, it's only useful as part of a more general strategy, where you're also doing a lot more on the ground, a lot more grassroots organizing as well.
land redistribution is a really key part of this puzzle because it attends to some of these democratic issues of who makes the decisions, who has the power to make these decisions. What are some of the asset transfer strategies? You mentioned community right to buy. What are the other ideas of how to get the stuff, how to transfer the land from those who have it to those who don't?
Well, this is where it becomes extremely difficult because we're talking about challenging the very basis of the power system in many countries, certainly in the UK. So I think community right to buy is a good starting point. In Scotland, I think they've got above 2% of land is in community land ownership. And what I like about it is it's a way in to getting people to think, this is working. Why don't we do this more wide? It should be more widespread. And I went and attended the Community Land Ownership Conference in Skye last June, just because I wanted to talk to people who were from these community buyouts. It was really quite emotional to hear them talk about how their ancestors had been excluded from this land. One guy said to me, I wish my grandfather could see us now. He said, it's ours. It's ours, finally. And he didn't mean mine. It's not mine. It's ours. So I think community land ownership is good for giving people this idea. I mean, it's not easy. I mean, we could talk separately about the problems of community land ownership, but it is something that means a lot to people and can inspire. So if you move on from there, you need certain things like actual limiting the size of land holdings. For example, you could say that no landowner has a right to whatever many hectares. And if they've got more than that, the government can compulsory purchase the extra. Or if you want to be more radical, you should say that they can just hand it over, because the people in question are people that probably have plenty of money anyway, and giving over, a quarter of their land for public or community ownership isn't exactly going to break the bank. And that extra land is then transferred to the public in some form. The other way that you could do it is by banning any kind of land buying for investment purposes. For example, investment I think a lot of farmland now can be used as a way of avoiding inheritance tax. So really banning corporations, investment companies buying land, and anyone who buys land can only buy so much, and they have to use it for the public benefit. So there's various other laws that you might introduce that makes buying of land unattractive. And of course, this brings us to the other problem of green landowners, in that a lot of people now are thinking, we don't really want to do anything about private land ownership because some of these landowners are really doing good things with the land. For example, the Paulson in Scotland, probably the largest landowner in Scotland, I believe. He's seen as a good landowner because he's doing all these good things with the land. But you have to think, fine, but where is the community involvement in the land that he's owning? So you might want to have to think twice about this carbon credit business, because at the moment, loads of companies are buying up land because they think they're going to make money out of it, through carbon tax, carbon credit trading, etc. I think another policy would be just to end that, so that no one is buying land purely in order to make a profit, that they're only buying land in order to use it for some kind of public good, and I include agroecological farming in that, or agroforestry in that.
There are a lot of politically left figures and institutions who ostensibly want most of the same things that I feel like the People's Land Policy wants, right? Good rural jobs, more convivial and community spaces, abundant and secure housing for all, reductions in fossil fuel use, but they would not agree that using land reform to achieve these goals is the right way to go, or maybe they don't even think about that. Why is this adjustment to land relations fundamental to these types of social and environmental outcomes? And then why do you think there's strong disagreement in the role that land plays in achieving these goals?
We need more land. There's not enough land, so people are fighting over a small amount of land and how that should be used. And the only way we're going to get more land is by getting it from those who own it now. First, stop selling off the public land, and secondly, beginning to get the land back from some of these big private landowners. Why is there disagreement? Number one, because people are in their own silos, so they don't really see anyone else's points of view, which is why it's important that we do something about that. And many people also believe that you can get landowners to do the right thing. And there have been some successes. So because it seems like let's not worry about any major land reform. If we can get the landowners to do the right thing in terms of the environment or whatever, or agroecology, then isn't that okay? We don't have to worry about it. But they don't realize that there's also huge social justice issues and economic justice issues and political justice issues involved, as well as having landowners use the land for what they think it should be used for. So these are different political perspectives. And so I suppose that's why there are disagreements. If we get more people together in things like land assemblies, then at least people could be talking together.
What would you say to someone who says there isn't anything intrinsically wrong with property? We don't need to abolish that or have all lands commons. If you achieved new rules about how we use land, or perhaps something even greater, which would be a cultural awareness of what land is for, land for what, right? Then property itself could be changed to be used something different.
Well, this is what I'm saying, is that there is something intrinsically wrong with private property. There's loads wrong with private property. Partly because you have the right to exclude, partly because it gives you the right. I mean, you say, oh, well, we would control what the landowner does. But basically, if it's private property, it's the idea that the landowner can do what they want on their property. That's the whole idea. The whole idea of private property is that they are the ones to benefit from that land, that they don't have any necessarily responsibility to the public because it is their land. They can exclude people from their land. And it's a completely different mentality from the mentality of land as the commons. So all you have to do is contrast, our attitude, in UK attitude, to that of Indigenous people. And more people are looking to Indigenous people to say they have such a different attitude. They belong to the land. The land doesn't belong to them. So the other problem with private property, it's very unlikely that private property will provide the solution to all the social justice issues we're talking about. They may possibly become a bit greener. They might plant a few more trees or whatever, but they're certainly not going to provide that many benefits to a local community. I heard already that I think it's up in Cumbria that there's a landowner who's actually decided he's going to go for the green solution, and meanwhile the tenant farmers have been evicted from the land. That's what private property is. It's a mentality where the land is yours and you can exclude, and the land is for your benefit. I think that people who think, oh, it's not a problem, are deluding themselves, and that they'll find that the changes that you get from these landowners is going to be small. It might have some effect on the environment, but I don't think it's going to have a positive effect on food growing. Agroecology is very small indeed, and I can't see it growing unless you change the system of private property.
A core here is a question of land access and what types of land access are guaranteed to whom. And some of the academic work that's guided my thinking on this comes from Sikor and Lund, and they really talk about what turns an access claim, a claim to land, into durable property is really something all about legitimacy. So these kind of socio-legal institutions rely on legitimacy to keep their power of authority. And therefore, there's this constant struggle of trying to legitimize access claims amongst different competing uses. And the ones who are deemed more legitimate, that's what ends up being what we know as state-backed property. And the other stuff is what we know is as, radical or illegal use. And they write in this one paper that is influencing me, in the attempt to understand the relations between struggles over natural resources and contestations about authority and state formation, attention to legitimizing strategies will be rewarded. What might you describe as the key, either known or potential, legitimizing practices, the legitimizing strategies of the people's land policy? How do you legitimize these alternative visions of land access?
I suppose, firstly, we actually see the other claims as not being legitimate. we would argue that private property and the way it is backed up by the state is not legitimate. Land was stolen. We could go back to the Norman conquest, but the whole idea of private property and the first person putting a fence up around and saying, this is mine, was never legitimate. There's been quite a lot of work on state formation and how the whole idea of the nation state arose, and part of its purpose was to protect private property. I mean, certainly in America, private property was one of the key things around the formation of the U.S. state. So our role, we see more, is to disrupt and challenge the current legitimacy, to say that what we have at the moment is not legitimate. It's land having been stolen from us. And there's much more awareness of this, again, as I referred to before, in the global south. And that's why we have actually tried to work quite a lot with different groups like the London Mining Network, Global Women's Strike, the Decolonial Centre, and looking at how people in other places have a very different attitude towards the legitimacy of private property backed up by the state. State, one of its main roles, in fact, is to protect private property. And we would see this as completely illegitimate. And there's other things. A way of doing it is looking at history that helps us, like 3 Acres and a Cow. There's a sort of musical and story performance about land rights and history. The Land magazine and others have made a point of showing how land has actually been stolen by us, which is how in Scotland, the whole idea of land ownership is much more illegitimate because of this whole idea of the clearances that forms part of their history and that informs their thinking. And also, there is a whole history in Britain, which we also lay claim to, of questioning private property, for example, the diggers and the levelers. There's loads of narratives and traditions that challenge the legitimacy of private property, control of natural resources, with the backup of the state, which stops people actually gaining access to these resources and supporting private property ownership. And then the legitimacy comes when people, I don't even know if I like the word legitimacy, because legitimacy according to who? And we have our vision, and we would like people to share that vision. We think our vision is something that many people share. They share because it's part of what it means to be human. So the legitimacy almost goes back to the nature of humanity. And humanity's struggle to have a better life, to have good social relations, to live communally with each other. And it's all about happiness and well-being for people. And we believe that a different system that's not based on private property would make people happier and would improve people's well-being. And therefore, it's legitimate in the sense that it improves the condition of humanity. But it will only be taken forward when people believe it's possible. And the problems, of course, we face is people are so entrenched in this idea that, what can we do about private property? Well, this is normal. And we're trying to say to people, that's not normal. It's not normal at all. That's what it is. It's trying to get people to question normalcy.
When I was younger, I used to feel pretty optimistic that new environmental pressures would create new legitimacy for alternative land relations, because if the current land relations and property regime has led us here, then obviously that needs to change. But as you mentioned, with the rise of kind of green landowners, how do you think of the legitimizing practice of new land relations for a better environment might hold up?
I think it is a real problem, because I've already could mention a few people who I feel have given up on the whole idea of land justice because they feel that the green landowners are doing the job, that you don't really need land reform because, they're making big changes in how land is used and the environment is the most important issue. But I don't think that any solution that relies on people doing it because they're making a profit is a long-lasting solution. So, and that is what the current system is based on. These people who are, I'm sure there's some landowners, who are very well-meaning, etc., etc. It doesn't do a lot for local democracy. But there's others that are purely there for because it helps with marketing. For example, up in the Cairngorms, you've got Brewdog, who has bought an estate up there. And if they can say, oh, look what we're doing, look at our carbon footprint, it's a way of improving their marketing. So you have all these people actually doing it because it makes a profit. So they're not particularly interested in the environment. So I don't think that any long-term changes can happen for the environment by just having some landowners planting more trees or do a bit of peatland restoration. Because also, we're onto the environment now, but the environment issue is so much bigger than that. So again, a whole thing about how land is used and the whole issue of growth and the whole issue of, you could plaster all of Scotland with wind farms. I mean, there's already loads have gone out. Or green technology, And if you look at mining, which is a land use issue, so many of the solutions to the environment rely on certain minerals, certain technologies that still require loads of resources. And you also have to look at the cost of those resources in terms of the workers who are working that. And that's why we have good relations with the London Mining Network, who supports communities around the world who are fighting mining initiatives, because a lot of these mines have been horrendous for the community. So all these solutions that are still basically within capitalism are not going to provide a long-term solution to the environment.
I wonder, as a last question, explain to me, as if you were looking back 10 years after some of the major ideas of the People's Land Policy had been successful, can you describe, as if you were looking back, the key moments in history that led to a policy victory?
For the PLP, I think success is defined in terms of the strength and size of a grassroots movement for land justice. If more and more people are talking about land, seeing things in terms of land reform, using concepts of like the commons and stewardships, then we feel we will have had some success. If we're talking about some reforms, I think first things like stopping the sale of public land, a massive increase in community ownership, much more land owned by groups like the Ecological Land Co-op, land assemblies springing up around the city where groups come together to shape their place, developing resilient communities and communities of care as part of this. If there's more links that we can see between urban and rural areas, for example, direct access to farmers for urban consumers, and we have seen that already with a group called Granville Community Kitchen, who has direct access in London, who has direct access to farmers. Reducing the supply chain as much as possible, cutting out more of the supermarkets. If we could see these things happening, if community buyouts were actually able to show how the livelihood interests and environmental aims can come together, because I think there's often a conflict between livelihood aims and conservation aims, and it's a real problem when moving forward in talking about land use. But if community buyouts can show how people working together in a community can balance those two aims, if we can actually have some success stories, all these, I think, are possible in the next 10 years. And I would see that as a success, not for us, but obviously for everyone. We would see that as a step forward. However, I think before that grassroots movement needs to strengthen and become more united. We need to bring in a diverse range of people, because again, it's dominated by the same people. People are university educated, or even people like, myself, I'm retired, so I've got more time. So we need to have a diverse range of people, giving more people confidence to speak out. So in other words, we'd like to see a huge increase in participation from all sorts of people. If this all happens, then we will be able to put pressure on those with power to make changes within the current system. Obviously, we would hope that this would be a first step to making much more fundamental changes.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you for coming on the podcast and talking about the People's Land Policy.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
That's it for this episode of Landscapes. Thanks for listening. Thanks again to Bonnie for taking time to represent the People's Land Policy and for sitting for the interview. You can find all of the papers, notes, and links mentioned in the episode in the show notes. A written transcript of the entire interview can be found at the Land Food Nexus newsletter, adamcalo.substack.com. That's where you can also get in touch. I'd love to hear your feedback. This episode of Landscapes contributes to the UKRI Landscapes Decisions Program.